Okay, so we had spoken about, the idea that the agricultural revolution, the beginning of agricultural activity in what is now northern New Mexico, really changed cultural patterns, that Native American groups were no longer nomadic hunter-gatherers, but were able to settle in communities and develop cities, etc. Eventually, those cities developed their agriculture was developed to the degree that they had surplus agriculture, and they were able to sponsor merchants and traders, which did long-distance trade with other groups. So in particular, our famous Chaco Canyon, which is up there by Cuba, New Mexico, on the road to Farmington, it was a beautiful trade center, and if you haven't had a chance to visit that place, it's quite remarkable, and more so once you understand the engineering and design behind not only the architecture but the civil planning of the city. Because the city of Pueblo Bonito, one of the larger municipalities in Chaco Canyon, is laid out that the city itself is both a calendar and a watch at the same time. That, given the position of the shadows, you could tell what time of day and what time of year it is. A remarkable engineering feat. But besides the engineering and the spirituality that occurred at Chaco Canyon, it was also a center for trade, and part of that trade extended deep into Mesoamerica, extended into the Ohio and the Mississippi River valleys, particular trade with Cahokia culture and some Midwestern cultures. There's evidence that some Pacific Northwest cultures has also done trade at Chaco. So this was before planes, trains, and automobiles, that there were some trade routes that were coming out of that area and eventually coming out of Zuni as well, that extended into many parts of the Americas and down into Central and Middle America. For me, one of the remarkable ideas is that they had chocolate up here, because Three Sisters agriculture we mentioned during that agricultural revolution. Three Sisters agriculture begins 7,000 years ago in Mexico, makes its way up here 4,000 years ago, and gets practiced as an agricultural activity. So that's a viable diet. Corn, beans, and squash, the Three Sisters agriculture. Corn, beans, and squash, that's a complete diet. The nutritional values of those three elements tie in and make for a complete diet. You add chili and chocolate on top of that, then you got your dessert and your flavor. So that's a full meal. There's evidence that chocolate was being brought up to Chaco Canyon as part of that larger network. And it's viable and demonstrable that those trade routes came through now what is now Las Vegas. Maybe 700 years before Las Vegas existed as a municipal establishment during the Mexican period. Again, it was a site for trade. Eventually, the Spanish exploration comes into the area, and the Coronado expedition comes through. Oñate expedition establishes San Juan de los Caballeros in Oquiohuine, Pueblo, and we have the beginning of the land grant system. Now, during that Spanish colonial period, there was trade with the Comanche, the Kiowa, Lipan Apache, Hickory Apache, and other plains groups. And it's viable to think that some of those rendezvous and some of those trade exchanges took place here where the mountains meet the plains, which is Las Vegas. Again, this is a border zone. And in framing it as a border zone, it's within our interest to consider that a border isn't where something begins and something stops, but it's a zone of exchange, a zone of creativity, a zone of ambiguity and unclear culture and language patterns, etc. But it's also a site for creativity. So in Las Vegas, being in that topographic geological area of the mountain meeting the plains, then it's been privy to and benefited from those kind of exchanges of people coming together not only for trade, but for cultural dissemination purposes as well. And so there's some beautiful paintings that speak about the Comancheros, the Ciboleros, who were Spanish colonizers that had ventured into the plains either as buffalo hunters or to trade with the Comanche. And so where would you do that? Right where the mountains meet the plains. And so that would be Las Vegas. So again, it's a little bit more difficult to find archaeological or physical evidence of that because they were exchanges that had taken place on the run, kind of traveling salesman sort of orientations, and very likely that they had taken place here in Las Vegas. Eventually, Las Vegas gets established as a municipality, as a land grant. And if you think about it, Santa Fe, many of us are familiar with the history that Santa Fe is established as the capital city of northern Spain, La Nueva España, in 1610. It takes 200 years for the Spanish to come over 35 miles east of Santa Fe and establish San Miguel del Vado and eventually Las Vegas as land grant areas. And the reason it took them so long to explore this area and to come over was because of the dangerous conditions of raiding plains groups, particularly the Comanche that were raiding fields, raiding indigenous pueblos, Sequoia and Pecos. That was often raided by the plains groups, different plains groups. So it took a while for the Spanish to find appeasement and to find peace within nomadic plains groups. And by this time, by the 1800s, when Las Vegas gets established as a land grant community, Native American groups like Lakota, Dakota, Kiowa, Comanche, Crow, Sioux, etc., they'd already had significant cultural change because they've accommodated the use of horses. The horses were, of course, introduced by the Spanish a couple of years earlier. But again, Plains culture Indians, they adapt readily, and there's a very significant cultural shift of those populations, those communities, because they had the mobility and the access to horses for means of transport and other traditional and practical needs. So it takes a while for the Spanish to find appeasement with those plains groups, and eventually they start settling within Las Vegas as a land grant activity, benefiting from the previous San Miguel del Vado land grant that was established in the late 1700s. So being in the position where Las Vegas was, and it being established during the Mexican period, Las Vegas is a sort of border town during that period, from 1830s up into 1848. It's the first township in what was then the Mexican territory. Again, the Spanish claimed this territory for 300 years. Mexico claims this territory, which is now the Southwest United States. That was claimed for about 35 years. And during that period, the closest municipality to the U.S.-Mexico border was Las Vegas. So you could think of Las Vegas as being a border city, not placed on the border, but being the first municipal site that was in the Mexican territory. So consequently, for reasons of exchange and trade and cultural borrowing and explorations, Las Vegas had the trimmings of a border town, whether it be economic or whether it be more aesthetic or linguistic or other areas of cultural behavior. That's where it has. So that's part of the colorful history of Las Vegas, is that we see that, again, different kind of cultural entities come into place, recognizing that there's ambiguity. And of course, there's the idea that it was a lawless city. I kind of disagree with that to a big degree, even though we have a plethora of outlaws and dubious characters that came through and that were found semi-permanency here in the town. During that period, the Mexican period, of course, the Santa Fe Trail comes into place, and they're following trails that were established during that Native American trade program. And remember, I mentioned that, with the Native American trade that was coming out of Chaco Canyon, that extended into Central America. So that route of the Camino Real that comes from Mexico City up into Santa Fe and actually up into Taos, that was an indigenous trail. It wasn't it wasn't discovered by Spanish explorers and colonizers. They followed trade routes that were not documented, but well known by indigenous populations. So the Santa Fe Trail potentially followed those Native American trade routes as well. It wasn't a discovery of Becknell, but rather he'd followed trade routes that made sense and that followed Native American commerce, network, and trade that had taken place hundreds of years previously. So again, Las Vegas benefits from the idea that it's on a well-established trade route that had been in existence for hundreds of years and wasn't necessarily a discovery. Eventually, the railroad comes into place and crosses over here west of Las Vegas in Kearney Gap, and it exercises once again the opening of the West and the incorporation of different elements, both beneficial and nauseous to the area. And that's part of our local history, to the degree that some of those elements that came into Las Vegas during the Mexican period benefited from the ambiguity of the United States government coming into place and not recognizing all the amendments of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which guaranteed the private ownership. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which was the peace treaty after the War of Mexico and the United States, guaranteed the rights of the then Mexican population here in the Southwest, including their property rights, their religious culture, their language, etc., etc. And from the sense of property rights, that was quickly dissipated, and the Las Vegas land grant, we could spend a couple hours alone speaking about what had occurred with the Las Vegas land grant. But in a synthesis, it was very quickly lost from the original heirs, the herederos of the Las Vegas land grant lost their land real quick. And that's part of the local history as well, because there was such a desire for New Mexico land, and the Santa Fe Ring was well in place. Some of the corruption of government and judicial elements led to a real quick usurpation and appropriation of local lands. One of the areas that was contested was, again, the privatization of land grant, because both during the Spanish and the Mexican land grant, there was a part of the awards of a land grant to a community where it included ejido land, or what was understood as commons land. And as stipulated between by those protocols, those ejido lands, those common lands, were to be held in perpetuity by the communities that had received the award. And so those were supposed to be in forever use to the avail to the local population, and the encroachment within the United States economy and their ideas on private ownership caused for some conflicts in the area. And that actually brought attention to Las Vegas in the 1880s, when the group known as the Guerras Blancas contested the partitioning off and the separation of private land tracts that were part of the Las Vegas common lands. And so I'm not sure if eventually you're going to develop that out as a talking point because it didn't make it into the Las Vegas history books.
Part 2 on that.
Part 2, we'll come back to that one as well. So eventually there's some contestation and resistance from indigenous population, the Mexican population, the Native American population that were in the area when they no longer had access to their common lands, and their livelihood, their subsistence patterns were disrupted with the idea of private ownership coming into place. And again, partially the sponsorship of the railroad coming in and opening new markets. There's a significant shift in pastoral activity in what was historically sheep raising ranches and sheep raising country, transitioning to the cattle industry. And much of the cattle industry is designated for a larger market, including California and back east. So there's several elements that have some sort of play on the local economy as the area is opened up because of its proximity to the trade routes of the Santa Fe Trail and the railroad coming into place impacted the economy in a lot of different areas, not only in economic but also from an ecological sense, because much of the logging that had taken place to sponsor the westward development of the railroad, a lot of that logging came out of the local community as well. So there was some clear cutting of the forests up in the mountains west of Las Vegas and up in the Mora Valley and even up as far as way as what is now where Angel Fire is, the Moreno Valley. There was logging that was coming out of those areas that contributed to development of the railroad. So there's a lot of economic behaviors and a lot of economic practices that are coming into place. And to some degree, it devastated the local economy because the local economy was based more on subsistence and cooperation and sharing, principles of land stewardship and community building. And the American system comes in, and it's a different system, more geared towards a big general category of progress, which meant appropriation of natural resources and the privatization and the commodification of those resources rather than the communal sharing. So there's a very significant shift in culture and economies and subsistence way of life patterns when the American government comes into place. And we still see much of that today.
When did the railroads start to come? What time period?
Late 1870s.
1870. Okay, that's a lot. Is there something else you want to add to any of this that you talked about? Like maybe when you were talking about stuff that from the past are impacting today? Like I know the fires impacted a lot of subsistence economic existence.
If I could comment on that, is where the impact of the fire is certainly it devastated our local communities. Not only the fire itself, but the resultant flooding that happened that is still having a bearing and still having an impact. But I'm hoping to think optimistically that with the federal resources coming in place and the coalition formation and the coagulation of community really came together in a beautiful manner, that we appreciate the firefighters and other resources that came into place. But I see a lot of stories of people helping neighbors and caring for one another, coming back to that idea of community as a coagulating force within our community. So I'm hoping that within the renewed discussion of what community development would come about with the reparation monies coming into place, that it brings forward our discussion as to these value systems that were originally established with community, the value system of querencia, of land stewardship, the value system of mutualidad and mutualism, of people helping one another, cooperation and collaboration. I hope that those are the anchor values that we're using when we pursue our discussions of what do we want to see with the rebuilding of our communities coming out of the devastation.
Okay, good.